Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. The president's legal team wrapped up its opening arguments in the Senate impeachment trial. Mr. Trump's lawyers claimed Democrats were using the proceedings to remove the president from office during an election year.
What they are asking you to do is to throw out a successful president on the eve of an election with no basis and in violation of the Constitution. It would dangerously change our country and weaken forever all of our democratic institutions. You all know that's not in the interest of the American people.
But the president's team and House Democrats have now presented their cases. Up next, senators will have their chance to ask questions. Once that's over, we could see a potential vote on new witnesses. Calls for more testimony have been intensifying. Lawmakers want to hear from John Bolton. The former national security advisor reportedly writes in an upcoming book that President Trump directly linked the withholding of military aid to Ukraine with an investigation into the Biden family. You'll recall this is at the heart of the case for impeachment. Lead impeachment manager Adam Schiff said today it's now all the more urgent lawmakers vote in favor of introducing additional witnesses. The House Intelligence Committee chairman urged Republicans to allow Bolton to appear.
The president's lawyers are this duplicitous, I kid you not. They come into the Senate, which they refer to as a court, and they say the House should have sued in court to enforce subpoenas on witnesses like John Bolton, and they go to court and they say the House may not sue in court to compel a witness to testify. That is the legal duplicity of the president's team. And it's in black and white.
Let's bring in our panel: Keir Dougall, Molly Hooper, Zeke Miller, and Sheryl Gay Stolberg. Keir is a CBSN legal contributor and former federal prosecutor. Molly is a CBSN political contributor. And Zeke is a CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for the Associated Press. And Sheryl is a congressional correspondent for the New York Times. Welcome to all of you. Sheryl, I want to start with you. What's been the reaction on Capitol Hill now that opening arguments are over?
You know, one thing that I'm struck by, perhaps the thing that I'm most struck by, is that minds really haven't changed. You know, we've gone through day after day, hour after hour of sometimes mind-numbing oral arguments. And really, at the end of the day, we are still exactly where we were when we started, and that is that Republicans are convinced that this president does not deserve to be convicted and removed from office. Democrats are convinced that he is. And interestingly, the arguments, in a way, are the flip side of each other. Democrats are saying the Republicans are running a sham trial. Republicans are saying Democrats are running a sham prosecution. Democrats say Republicans would violate the Constitution if they allow Trump to remain in office, and Republicans say the opposite. So we're almost living in kind of this Rorschach test environment where everything mirrors everything else, and there's a huge partisan gulf in the middle of everything.
It really is this Rorschach test. It looks so vastly different depending on where you're sitting. Keir, let me ask you about the president's defense team. They did not use the full time that they had available to them. Do you think that strategically that was a wise move?
Well, I think they were balancing the need not to repeat themselves with the need to try to stick the landing. And you know, I think what it does is it leaves the spotlight on Alan Dershowitz's primetime speech last night about whether or not this conduct is impeachable under the Constitution. So it's another flavor of the, you know, does the conduct rise to the level, or is it impeachable at all? It's another flavor. But, you know, I appreciate what Sheryl just said about a Rorschach test, but really the Constitution does, in fact, have meaning. It does, in fact, have guideposts and limits for us. And the position that Alan Dershowitz espoused last night is really outside what the most constitutional scholars and even Alexander Hamilton believed.
And that is specifically that the offense is not an impeachable one.
He says it's not impeachable because there isn't a criminal act that's been alleged, but sort of all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, it was understood that you could commit misconduct that didn't rise to the level of a crime, but that still would warrant the removal of a president. And so you know, that's comes with hundreds of years of precedent from the English impeachments and what the framers themselves understood. So there really are, you know, there really are rules here. And so I think Sheryl is right. It sort of does look like a Rorschach test right now, but I think there actually are right and wrong, at least constitutional answers.
I want to come back to that notion in just a moment, but Zeke, let me turn to you. What do we know about the White House's reaction to the opening arguments?
Well, the White House seems pretty confident and bullish. They were confident after their performance on Saturday morning. Their sort of their opening couple of hours in their presentation, they were very happy with Alan Dershowitz's primetime address last night. They found their several hours spent yesterday on the Bidens and Burisma as sort of highlighting the political cost for Democrats should the witnesses be called. And then today, sort of going for that short and sweet closing was an indication of their confidence in their case. Obviously, none of the the chances of the president being convicted are exceedingly small, infinitesimally small, given the partisan makeup of the Senate, getting that 2/3 threshold. But when it comes, this is really all about that witness vote that's probably going to come later this week, and what that would be. And the White House still is, maybe less confident than they were a couple of days ago before the Bolton book excerpts and that manuscript sort of that revelation. Those revelations came out. They're a little less confident, but they're hopeful that their close, that Dershowitz's performance, may give Republicans more of a sort of maybe a little bit of a rallying cry for Republicans trying to hold the line on that on behalf of the president.
And Molly, let me ask you, tomorrow starts then the questions phase of this. What is that going to actually look like?
Well, it's going to be 2 days, approximately 8 hours apiece, if Mitch McConnell is to believe, as he described today. And it will follow largely along the question period back in 1999 with Bill Clinton. At that time, there were about 150 questions that were asked and answered on the Senate floor, roughly 5 minutes apiece, and that's something that Justice Roberts said he'd like to stick to. And essentially, what will happen is Mitch McConnell will take a question, walk it up, there's a question on paper, walk it up to Justice Roberts. Justice Roberts will read the question, say which side it is addressed to, and then which senators are asking that question. So we saw the Republicans all gather after today's proceedings. They had their closed-door conference, and a lot of that had to do with witnesses, but it also had to do with consolidating questions, which senator was going to get recognition essentially for asking a question, and the order in which they would be posed. Because remember, both sides are going to be asking pointed questions. Perhaps Chuck Schumer's side, the Democrats, will ask, why not call John Bolton? Why isn't what John Bolton has to say relevant? And they're going to do so in a very structured manner themselves.
And so, Keir, what is it that you're going to be listening to as those questions get underway? What specifically are you, as a prosecutor, looking at this from a legal perspective, a constitutional perspective, going to have your ear out for?
So in a regular criminal trial, sometimes or oftentimes jurors will send notes to the judge with questions, and you'll get an insight as to what they're focused on, what they're thinking about. And so I think if we get questions that are focused on, for instance, the impeachability question. Is it your position that if the president decided to take a permanent vacation and just stop working, not a crime to take a vacation, but would that be impeached? That type of question, I think, would signal weakness in the House's theory. Another type of question might be, don't presidents, even when they're acting in the interests, the agreed upon interests of the United States, don't they in the back of their mind also seek to burnish their own legacy and get reelected, right? Isn't there always sort of a mixture of a personal interest? You claim now that the president was acting predominantly or solely in his personal interest in these articles of impeachment. What is the difference? That would signal to me questions about how do we get to the motivation that is the wrongful conduct here? So types of questions like that would signal where the judges and jurors are sensing or probing weakness in the two cases.
Wow, fascinating. So Sheryl, after questioning, we can expect a vote on additional witnesses around Friday of this week. Do we know how Republican leadership is preparing for that?
So Republicans, right after the trial closing arguments, or opening arguments rather, wrapped up today, the Republicans retreated into a closed-door meeting where a lot of the discussion was about witnesses. And What they said coming out was that there really, frankly, is no consensus. We know already that Mitt Romney has said he is going to vote to have witnesses. Susan Collins has said she is very likely to vote to have witnesses. So that is 2 of the 4 Republican votes that Democrats will need in order to get witnesses to testify at the trial. Ted Cruz said coming out of that meeting, it's going to be very close. Kevin Cramer, another Republican senator, said that people were really talking a lot about what to do, about how this vote would affect them in their own states. And we really don't know how it's going to go, although frankly the betting is that Republicans in the end will muster the 51 votes that they need to block Democrats from calling witnesses. But it's still an open question.
Right, and all of this now is thrown into a bit of uncertainty here because of this manuscript, right? So
Right.
the president's defense team, Keir, largely brushed off the Bolton book manuscript. Jay Sekulow did not say point blank that Bolton's claims were false, but he did read several statements, including one from the president, essentially denying what Bolton alleges here. And let's listen to some of what Jay Sekulow had to say.
That was the response. Responding to an unpublished manuscript that maybe some reporters have an idea of maybe what it says. That's what the evidence, if you want to call that evidence, I don't know what you'd call that. I'd call it inadmissible, but that's what it is.
All right, what about that assertion, inadmissible evidence? From your perspective, is that inadmissible?
Well, it's a tip, it's a lead. And, so in the Senate, the senators get to decide what they want to hear. There aren't sort of the typical federal rules of evidence that you'd have in a courtroom. But the fact that, it's obviously relevant what Bolton would say, and the fact that it's now disputed, I think makes it even more important that you have live testimony about it. You can't cross-examine the manuscript. And for hundreds of years, the way it's not perfect, but the way that we found the truth in our courtrooms across the country is putting witnesses on the stand, put them under oath, and subject them to direct and cross-examination. You can observe them, you can tell if they're nervous or if they appear to be speaking the truth. We see all those signals.
Right.
That is the way that we get to truth. And so the question is, on this most important question of whether or not we're going to remove a sitting president in the middle of his term, do we want to have the best information, and do we want to get to the truth?
Well, Zeke, the president's former chief of staff, John Kelly, said today he believes Bolton. Can you remind us of the role Kelly played in the Trump White House and just how significant his comments are?
Well, John Kelly was the president's second chief of staff. He served for a little less than 18 months from the summer of 2017 through the end of 2018. He was there for some of the president's most consequential decisions. He was obviously the Secretary of Homeland Security before he was the president's chief of staff. He was in the room with the president. At the same time, like John Bolton, who was also in the room, their terms overlapped quite a bit. There was no love lost there with the president by the end of their term. They both left on acrimonious terms with the president. So it is interesting to hear that his is sort of the first major validating voice for John Bolton's account from the outside. He obviously was not still in the administration contemporaneously with all of the matters at hand we're dealing with the Ukraine. That said, that is sort of an important validator for John Bolton in terms of that he believes that account sounds right enough to him, and that he trusts John Bolton's word over the president's. So that is, obviously not the sort of thing alone that is that's not sort of thing that is admissible on the Senate floor, would necessarily change the minds of anyone, but is for the court of public opinion, that is an important validator for John Bolton here.
And Molly, as Sheryl said earlier, 51 senators need to be in favor of this in order for Bolton to testify. She mentioned Collins and Romney. Who are you keeping your eye on?
Well, also Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, who really isn't beholden necessarily to the Republicans, given that a couple of years ago she was running for re-election. She lost her primary to Joe Miller, a Republican in Alaska. She ended up running in the general as an independent, and she won. So this is a senator who really, she has the interests of her state at heart. Also, I will be looking for somebody like Lamar Alexander, who has sort of been on the fence, but he's an institutionalist. He's going to retire. It's just that he's good friends with Mitch McConnell as well, and he's getting a lot of pressure, I'm sure, from the majority leader. There's other quote-unquote institutionalists to keep an eye on. Rob Portman, perhaps, possibly Jerry Moran from Kansas, Shelley Moore Capito. They haven't really answered that question as to how they will vote for or against witnesses, but really, they have to weigh, and this is something Chuck Schumer said earlier today, what is the repercussion and the Twitter fallout from this president if they vote against him, essentially, and vote to hear from somebody like John Bolton? And that can be very difficult for senators. Also, there's this question of one for one, with Lindsey Graham saying that, well, if they get their one witness, we're going to open the floodgates to all these other witnesses. Well, that may be, but the thing is that those same 4 Republicans will need to vote for whomever their party or the White House wants to call. And so I'm not sure if they'd necessarily be on board with the Hunter Biden. They may be on board more so with a whistleblower, but not necessarily so much Biden. But you never know.
Yeah, well, Sheryl, what do we know about the plans to have Bolton's book used as evidence, possibly, if the former National Security Advisor doesn't testify himself?
Well, we might get Bolton's book sooner than we get Bolton himself.
Yeah.
A couple of Republicans, important ones, Jim Lankford and Lindsey Graham, came out this morning and said they would be interested in seeing Bolton's manuscript. But that said, this could be a complicated thing. First of all, Bolton is under contract with a publisher, right? The New York Times, my newspaper, got hold of either this manuscript or of people who described it. The stories have not been perfectly clear on that, and maybe his publisher doesn't want to give out the book, which is due out in March. Would they have to subpoena the book? How long would that take? Would the White House fight the subpoena? Would HarperCollins, the publisher, fight the subpoena? All these things are unanswered questions, but we do know that there is interest in the manuscript from some Republicans, and that's sort of a foot in the door for Democrats to at least get the document.
And Sheryl, you've covered Washington for a long time, and I wanted to get your take on the idea of John Bolton being a known entity in Washington, particularly in Republican circles. Can you just speak to that, the fact that this is not someone who has been known as a never-Trumper?
I have to say that you are really reading my mind, Elaine. I was standing here thinking, John Bolton is not some some out of the blue guy,
liberal.
right? He's a Republican
certainly not
stalwart.
a liberal. That's right.
Right. He's a Republican stalwart. He's a conservative foreign policy hawk. He was George Bush's ambassador to the United Nations. He has been, at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative think tank here. I mean, this is a guy who's devoted his life to the Republican Party and to the sort of muscular interventionist foreign policy wing of the Republican Party. So the idea that Republicans are tearing him down as unreliable or untrustworthy is kind of stunning in a way. And some of them are, many of them are. They're saying he's, who would you believe, President Trump or John Bolton? Well, a lot of longtime Republicans in Washington might say they would believe John Bolton, but they wouldn't say it out loud.
Right, which really speaks to the political environment that exists now in 2020.
Right.
Keir, let me turn to you. The president's lawyers have argued the charges against Mr. Trump are too vague to be enforced. Jay Sekulow said today Democrats were, quote, lowering the bar for impeachment. What do you make of that?
Right, so I think one of the core parts of that argument is about his intent, about whether or, they talked about it in terms of psychoanalysts and, how do you divine what he thought? And right, so the problem with that argument is that vast swaths of our federal criminal code depend on intent, right? It's self-defense or maybe it's a murder, for example. And there are other examples, particularly around corruption. And so the idea that it's too vague, well, we have lots of statutes that are constitutionally sound because they have a corruption element to them. That's what distinguishes the bad conduct from the good. The idea that there's no way for us to figure out what people intend in their actions, well, that's the meat and potatoes work of courts across our country and for literally for decades and centuries. And you build your case with circumstantial evidence. You build it knowing how reasonable people behave.
Mm-hmm.
You
have witnesses.
Right, who were there and can tell you what they said, or you have direct testimony, which is one of the better types of evidence that you could have from John Bolton.
Yeah. Meantime, Zeke, the president has made a number of significant policy decisions with the trial underway. Today, he unveiled his Middle East peace plan. What do we know about this?
Well, we know that this plan was drafted entirely between with the input of the U.S. and the government of Israel. The Palestinians have walked away from the table, have not been working with the U.S. since the president decided to move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem a couple of years ago. We know that it's exceedingly favorable to the Israelis in both broad and specific terms, and that the Israeli government is planning as soon as Sunday to begin formally trying to annex large swaths of the West Bank in areas that under this draft Trump plan would be included in the state of Israel. And doing that unilaterally without any buy-in from the Palestinians. That said, there have been some cautiously optimistic signs out of the region, not from the Palestinians, but some other governments who've said that it's a serious plan. But nobody in Washington, in Israel, and in the region really thinks that there's likely going to be any progress on this, while while the Palestinian government is led by Mahmoud Abbas, and then Netanyahu is leading the Israeli government. And also, obviously, while Hamas still controls the Gaza Strip. So it is a significant development to see this sort of plan laid out on paper. But in terms of actually moving the ball forward towards peace, nobody's truly optimistic that anything will happen anytime soon.
So, Molly, what was the reaction then on Capitol Hill?
Well, it's kind of a mixed reaction. Keep in mind, the House Democrats and the lawmakers, they actually received a 2-page summary. And based on that summary, based on statements I've seen and received, there's some optimism among House Democrats like Nancy Pelosi. It's the basis for negotiations, hopeful. Eliot Engel, House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman, also very hopeful that it could be, that a two-state solution was broached. But you go to the Senate, and I don't know if it's because they were sitting in the chamber all afternoon, but Elizabeth Warren came out swinging, saying there is no chance that this would even create a viable state for the Palestinian people. Chris Van Hollen was equally critical. So like I said, it's a little bit mixed up there on the Hill.
All right. Keir Dougall, Molly Hooper, Zeke Miller, and Sheryl Gay Stolberg, thank you all for helping us to navigate, yet again, another busy news day. Thanks to everyone.